Hey guys, I'm back, and it feels really good to be back. I honestly had trouble trying to figure out what videos I could be making during the pandemic because anything about what was going on seemed in no way optimistic at the time. So it feels like things are a little bit better, and we can proceed accordingly to talk about some new films and new things going on in the world. So without further ado, it's good to be back. Like I said, I'm glad that I've been able to get some new subscribers somehow in the meantime in this 2-year period, but things are going a little bit better. Star Trek has been doing a little bit better as well with Strange New Worlds, even though that has absolutely nothing to do with this video. But it's something cool to talk about just briefly, maybe for a future video. But we are here to talk about is a little film that was referenced in a very obscure manner in Spider-Man No Way Home. And the movie is referenced in the catacombs, aka Undercroft, aka Crypt Scene, aka Wizard's Dungeon. It has many names in the movie, and that is the Equalizer's Bradford May's Darkman II, The Return of Durant. So what is this sequel, Darkman II, The Return of Durant, that everybody's forgotten about since 1994 and 1995 during its production and release? It's a movie that does have a connection to the Marvel Universe. Darkman was originally a 1990 film directed by Sam Raimi, and of course Sam Raimi had a lot of influence on the Marvel Universe with his 3 Spider-Man films, and now with Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness. So Sam Raimi's been in the news again. There's even talk of a new Darkman movie coming up, so let's talk about all these things Darkman related, specifically Darkman II, The Return of Durant. In the scene where Doctor Strange is about to help Peter Parker get his wish to erase everyone's memories off the face of the planet, and somehow that includes all the records and digital archives of everything involving Peter Parker as well.
And they shot an episode of The Equalizer here in the 80s.
Magic has that element where it's free of plot holes. But who cares, this movie's really great, that movie was really fun and exciting. But in that scene, Doctor Strange talks about an episode of a 1980s television series called The Equalizer. Most people, when they think of The Equalizer, they think of Denzel Washington's movies or the new Queen Latifah TV show. But originally, The Equalizer was a 1980s series involving a number of British actors and American actors who had that kind of true espionage quality to it, kind of like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. So there is a Star Trek connection, so I wasn't bringing it up randomly. Robert Lansing, who played Gary Seven on the original series, was on the original Equalizer television series. And so was an actor named William Zabka, who had made a name for himself for the Karate Kid films, and now Cobra Kai. So shout out to you, Johnny Lawrence. But in that TV series, the production had a director named Bradford May. Bradford May was originally a director of photography. He made a name for himself on the movie Monster Squad, which is a kind of like the Avengers Assemble of monster movies. When Bradford May became a director, he would also go on to make Asteroid, one of the many asteroid hitting the Earth, Armageddon, Deep Impact type movies from 1997 and 1998, kind of like a battle of the meteors destroying humanity kind of era. I say it's one of the best films on that subject because it actually deals with the realistic reaction to meteors hitting the Earth. Kind of like MASH was to the war, it was like a MASH to a cataclysmic disaster. It's a great movie. It's also something that's only available on DVD at the moment. It stars Michael Biehn and Anthony Zerbe. One of many actors that Bradford enjoyed working with was Anthony Zerbe over the years. I also recommend checking it out. But back to the Sam Raimi connection. Sam Raimi had made the original Darkman in 1990 starring Liam Neeson. For some reason, Universal was interested in making a TV series early on and made a pilot. It had nothing to do with Bradford May later on, came out in 1992, but it wasn't greenlit, although it did star the original actor who played Robert G. Durant, Larry Drake, the late great Larry Drake. It's interesting because you can find it online on YouTube. But at some point Universal decided to make a course correction and wanted to make a sequel to Darkman as a feature film, which later became Darkman II, The Return of Durant. But Liam Neeson was now moving away from superheroes at the time and was focusing more on movies like Schindler's List and Michael Collins. So somehow Mr. May, who was more interested in independent films at the time, got introduced to the world of Darkman. Darkman / Dr. Peyton Westlake, a scientist turned monster who's struggling with the notion of whether he's a monster or a man. Very Quasimodo, Hunchback of Notre Dame sort of thing. And I think that was the ultimate direction that this movie ended up going if they wanted to keep this concept going and enhance it further in a way where audiences would understand Darkman. The one issue with the original Darkman is that Peyton embraces that he's a monster. So the idea then became, what can you do with such a superhero concept to make him actually more of a superheroic figure instead of just a monster who, like the Punisher, kills for revenge? But I think the thing that is most interesting about making a Darkman movie is that Bradford also tackled it as a cinematographer. He'd been known to also be a cinematographer on his own productions. He would direct, and he'd also be the director of photography. So creating a look that was more indicative of the movies that he wanted to make, where it typically was shot at night, kind of like the film Ice, with a lot of colors in his palette, something that involves some stark contrast, maybe characters in silhouette or in shadow. That's something that Darkman II presented to him as a universe in which he can explore light and also the concepts of light and dark and its themes. So it works out. It's pretty fun. That's enjoyable. Everybody likes that kind of sort of thing. Something that the movie does also really well, in addition to the great direction and the action sequences, is the dialogue. There's a review on IMDb that calls the film the Battle of the Well-Spoken, and I've always enjoyed the fact that it was called that. I think that is one of the best reviews and log lines to explain a movie I've ever heard in my life. Like, hands down, that is great. That is a fantastic way to explain this movie. So the dialogue by these 4 writers, 2 on the story, 2 on the screenplay, did a fantastic job with this really nutty idea. Well, in addition to that, somehow Larry Drake's character survived a helicopter crash, because honestly, he was one of the best things in the original film. The original movie made a mistake that it tried to make the secondary villain, who was kind of a twist villain, the actual mastermind in charge, when really Robert G. Durant was the most interesting guy because he was the theatrical one. He was larger than life. He was kind of a big guy. And in many ways, Darkman 2 remedies that by making it more about him. But somehow he survives a helicopter crash and he's in a coma. And then he wakes up from the coma in a very comic book way, something that Marvel Comics would enjoy the F out of, because this is something that, you know, you draw it with lightning, you draw it with some people staring around in disbelief, and boom, your villain is still alive. So once you get past that aspect of it being pretty ridiculous, I mean, it's a comic book movie, they're allowed to be ridiculous. It's cool to have Robert G. Durant continue his mob rule of the city, and Darkman slowly realize that the man who destroyed his life is still alive somewhere, hiding in the shadows. In both cases, the characters hide in the shadows and they slowly reveal themselves over time, which is a very excellent way to play out your structure of the story. But there's also a lot of fine detail involving the characters within the mob. You get to really understand these goons a lot more than you do in the first film, which I think is an improvement. In the first film, the goons are just kind of killed in interesting ways. In this movie, they actually have names that you remember, like Roy and Eddie and Whitey. That's got to be one of the silliest names of all time, but it totally fits this albino-looking guy. Even Rollo, who somehow has a name of a robot from a 1990s computer game. They all have very interesting dialogue that explains their characters very quickly. For example, Eddie seems to be the mathematician of the group, and his little moment of explaining what's going on in a very short amount of time with Rollo's abuse of power is an awesome scene. Also, the actresses in the film, whether it's Kim Delaney or Renee O'Connor, have very interesting characters to play with. Their characters are great too, as the foil to what's going on with Darkman Peyton Westlake in his quest to figure out what's going on with Robert G. Durant. Renee O'Connor's character Laurie is pretty much the most interesting character. She is the sex worker with a heart of gold, which is a bit of a cliche, but in the 90s that was kind of the thing. There was a lot of movies about guys trying to help that kind of woman out of the business. But in her case, she's a little bit more interesting because she has a brother character that is connected to Westlake's science and skin formula research, and when something happens to him, she becomes more important to the story and thusly becomes someone to help Peyton reclaim his humanity. And Kim Delaney, she plays a news reporter, which interestingly enough, she's the sister of actress Dana Delaney, who also played a reporter vocally on Superman the Animated Series, Lois Lane, the ultimate reporter heroine. She's somebody that Peyton has a chance to talk with in a few scenes, and their conversations are almost a little flirty, which is interesting considering what's happened to Peyton and her understanding of what is Peyton these days. This finally leads us to the second official casting of Darkman Peyton Westlake, and that is the South African actor Arnold Vosloo. Everybody knows Arnold Vosloo from the first two Mummy movies directed by Stephen Sommers. Arnold is such an interesting Darkman because his voice is fantastic for a superhero character. And I think Bradford must have realized that the instant this guy talked. When you hear Arnold's voice, it's something like, "Laurie, that whole corporation is a front. They work for a man named Durant." And also something like, "Batteries not included." His voice is excellent for that kind of shadow interpretation. If you don't know who the Shadow is and how that connects to Darkman, I recommend the old Orson Welles radio play. So Arnold Vosloo kind of plays him a little bit more like the Shadow, and I think that's kind of who Darkman represents today. He's a modernized version of the Shadow. It'd be really cool to see somebody like the Shadow or even the Spirit done properly, but I think Darkman is probably one of the better reinventions of that kind of man in the trench coat and jumping from the curtains or hanging from the chains or hanging up in the rafters. He's that kind of character who's a little bit like Batman, not quite like Moon Knight, but he's somewhere in between this guy who uses his science to recreate faces and skin on his body so that he can pretend to be other people as an infiltrator. That's something that Darkman has an interesting advantage, and they only last 99 minutes. Is very interesting. It creates tension that the skin is going to collapse, and also it gives them an objective to work with Dr. Brinkman in order to pass the 99-minute barrier. But I think the ultimate end result of this film, asking us, has Peyton become more of a man again thanks to saving Laurie and also avenging Dr. Brinkman, her brother. I think that that's very, very good. I think in many ways that's a more interesting conclusion than the original Darkman film. I think people appreciate that the original Darkman film has a really good budget and it's really exciting and it's got some of that quintessential Sam Raimi hyperness, but I think Bradford and his attention to the cinematography and the fact that he's taken his time with the pacing and the editing and the extended director's cut also benefits from having a pace that doesn't feel in any way rushed. I think that that's what makes Darkman II: The Return of Durant a superior sequel, in my humble opinion. I think Sam Raimi ultimately was very, very fond of Larry Drake and his performance in this film. He really wanted him to do more Darkman films, and for some reason Universal wasn't really interested in making anything beyond 3. I don't really like Darkman 3, Die Darkman Die, really at all. I think they dropped the ball on that script, and some of the budget really looks limited, if I want to be kind, for that film. But yeah, you can sorely tell that a Darkman film without Robert G. Durant in some way is a hard pill to swallow. I think Greg Nicotero, who later went on to do Walking Dead, did a really excellent job on the makeup on this film. In the original film, Darkman looks really juicy, to quote The Mummy. In this film, he looks a little bit more healed, like his wounds have cauterized and, become a little bit more scabby, which is just a very tasty thing for me to be talking about right now. But for the most part, the makeup is pretty great. I actually think the makeup on Robert G. Durant's scar is excellent. Like the scar on his face, just to make him look a little bit more demented, is great. It's not really what I would expect from surviving a helicopter crash. He'd probably look a little bit more like Darkman. But to make things less confusing, let's not make two guys look like Freddy Krueger. The action sequences in this film are also very fun. There's a really interesting sequence when Ivan and Darkman start fighting, and Darkman's pretending to be Ivan. They are pretty much the same guy. It's like two stuntmen that look exactly the same, or two twins fighting each other off to the death. That sequence is great because it's in silhouette, so it doesn't matter that you can't tell who's who, because that's the whole joke. So when you watch something like this, and it's very reminiscent of some shots from Ice, another great film I recommend. There's a number of things like that Bradford May can get away with in his lighting that most directors would go, oh geez, this is a mistake. But here you could totally get away with it because the context helps. Also, the film has one of the best slow chases I've ever seen. It's the chase through the traffic. You get little glimpses of things like that in Men in Black and US Marshals, but there's a sequence in the Canadian traffic of the goons and Robert chasing Peyton, who looks like Eddie, down the streets, and Eddie's trying to figure out how to get Laurie out of there in time, who's in a slow-moving taxi cab. And the sequence is a combination of suspense and just pure hilarity. It's great. I love the sequence because you can tell they spent a lot of their production value on this one action scene, but it's, for some reason, even though these guys are all running parallel to slow-moving vehicles, it's a very exciting sequence because of the way it's shot. There's a lot of handheld photography, there's a lot of stuff with cameras on tracks, there's cars crashing into hot dog stands, there's people crashing into cars, there's people shooting at cars. It's great. It's a freaking excellent sequence. There's a lot of cool stuff like Darkman hanging off chains and sparks flying behind him. There's stuff where Darkman is flying on wires, and even Darkman fleeing his arm in the air with backlighting is awesome. The whole movie is a smorgasbord of just cool damn shots. This finally leads us to the most important discussion, and that is the director's cut, or the Sci-Fi Channel extended cut. It's a hard cut to find. It definitely can be found. In 1999, they premiered it on the Sci-Fi Channel, so you have to look for it. But there's specific shots that are not in the theatrical / VOD cut. Some of them are like really simple, like shots of a building or establishing shots of Peyton's lab. But there's other things like some action sequences are cut a little bit differently. The action sequence involving the car twirling in the air doing 360s, that's actually longer in the extended cut. Therefore, the word extended is now, by extension, justified. But it's one of the cuts that I've heard from Mr. May directly that he really prefers. So if you can find it, it's out there. Even IMDb has a list in its alternate version section of all the different cuts and the differences, whether they are minute or not, or extreme, and takes out a little bit of the more disjointed elements. For example, this sequence involving the remote control bomb is a lot more disjointed in the first cut versus the extended cut. I'm not sure why this sequence is shorter. I suppose they cut it for time to make it fit on VHS or DVDs, but when you see the entire sequence play out, it's great, and I wish this version was out and more readily available so I don't have to keep looking for it as a birthday present for people. But the great thing about this movie is every time I've shown this film, people are enamored over it. They fall in love with it without any other better explanation. It's something that they become slightly obsessed with, wondering, why have I not seen this movie? Why did I miss out on this as a kid? If you're a millennial, it was great to watch this movie in the 90s. I had a VHS of this movie that ended up breaking my VCR. I couldn't get the VHS tape out, and somehow this led to my parents buying DVDs for me in the mid to late 90s, so it worked out. I even knew somebody once who wasn't that impressed with the original Sam Raimi Darkman, saw this film, saw the sequel, and decided, I think they did a better job with this concept and did everything they could with this concept. So even he was impressed. So now we can talk about the most recent news, which is Universal's talking about making another Darkman film, and that they might want Liam Neeson to come back to reprise his role. According to Sam Raimi, he doesn't seem like he's that involved in it. He's just hearing about it. Bradford May is just now hearing about it. Mr. Raimi doesn't think that Mr. Neeson would come back to play the part, considering how much older he is and maybe doesn't want to go through all that makeup again. But who knows? I wouldn't mind seeing another Darkman film. I grew up on Darkman. It's one of my favorite superhero characters. It's one of my favorite characters connected to Marvel. Suffice to say, a limited series with Marvel. I still like Darkman. I would love for it to be part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe at some point. I think if Universal is making this movie, it kind of delays that process. I would love to see Darkman in Madripoor, you know, where Wolverine hangs out. That would be really cool. I think they could do a lot more with that if they wanted to, with that connection in the Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which they explored recently on the Disney Plus show. I don't know how Darkman could possibly fit into a Disney-run Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's the same questions I have involving Deadpool. Maybe Deadpool being extremely rated R would be something that is more 20th Century Studios. Back when Disney had Touchstone Pictures as a front, or Hollywood Pictures as a side venture to make a movie like The Rock. Technically, The Rock is a Disney movie. What does The Rock have to do with any of this? Michael Bihn's in The Rock. Bradford May directed Michael Biehn in Asteroid. Boom, I made it go full circle. If they're really seriously going to venture to make a Darkman movie, I just want it to be a good movie. I think the third film was quite horrific. It would be nice to just make Darkman, Darkman 2, and then skip ahead to something else. Darkman 3 happens in a tangent alternate universe. We're okay with that. They've done that before in the MCU. We can forgive being human every once in a while and making mistakes. I highly recommend checking out more Bradford May films, the ones that he's directed, or the ones that he was the director of photography on. They're all great. You can see Darkman II, The Return of Durant streaming somewhere. Because it's his most popular film, it's probably somewhere in cyberspace. Like I said, Mortal Sins is very hard to find because it's only on Laserdisc, tragically. Hopefully that will be remedied one day. One of his best later films, it's one of my personal favorites, is a film called Working Miracles. It's also known as Healing Hands in other countries. It's also a movie similarly about a man trying to understand his powers and whether he's a monstrous influence on society. It's great, highly recommend it. If you guys want to find out more about his career, you can also check out my Filmgram lessons on my Instagram. It's in the highlights right below my bio. It's right there. Check it out. He's pretty close to James Cameron and Joel Schumacher as far as I'm concerned in terms of his impact on history of cinema. So check out the extended director's cut of Darkman II, The Return of Durant. I hope Darkman will have a really great future within Marvel or the rest of the annals of moviedom, and hopefully you guys will check out the rest of my videos, film critiques, vlogs, music, what have you. I'm not going to bore you with the whole subscribe and like stuff because that's cliche and everybody's going to know that 100 years from now anyway. In many ways, Martin Scorsese is right. It should be more about cinema and not just content. So hopefully this is a step in the right direction. So I'm just glad that you guys watched the video. Hopefully to see you guys later in later videos. Peace, twice. It's all about part 2.